This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to speak about something a little bit different. The pasuk says in Parshas Vayigash, when Yaakov Avinu found out the good news that Yosef was still alive, so the pasuk says, Vayisa Yisrael v'chal asher lo, and Yaakov Avinu traveled, Vayavoy be'ir Shava, Vayizbach zevachim, and he offered sacrifices Leiloi Aviv Yitzchak, to the God of his father Yitzchak. So Yaakov Avinu is offering sacrifices to the Rebbeinu Shalom, who is being called in this pasuk the God of his father Yitzchak. So the Medrash in the Bereshis Rabbah comments on this pasuk that this is the most unusual pasuk in the whole Torah. Why would that be? Sounds pretty simple to me. Yaakov Avinu brought karbanos and he offered it to the Rebbeinu Shalom, the God of Yitzchak. That's what we say in Shemona Esrei, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yisrael, Elokei Yaakov. Says the Medrash, Amar Rabbi Shiur ben Levi, Chizarti al kol balei agada shabadarim. I took this pasuk to every rabbi in the south, every baldarshan, every speaker, every disseminator of Torah. Shayomruli pasuk zeh. Could someone please tell me pshat in the pasuk? It seems like the difficulty is, why is the Rebbeinu Shalom is being referred to as Elokei Aviv Yitzchak? Why not Elokei Aviv Avraham? Why not Elokei Yaakov? Says Rabbi Yochanan Amar, the reason why the Rebbeinu Shalom in this pasuk is called the God of Yitzchak, Shechayiv Adam b'chvoid Aviv Yoser mikvoid Zakenai. One is obligated to honor his father more than his grandfather, and therefore, when Yaakov Avinu was bringing the carbon, like when we daven, we begin Shemona Esrei by offering kavod to our ancestors. We say, "Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov." So Yitzchak was bringing the carbon, so he honored his father Yitzchak by saying, "I'm bringing this carbon to the God of my father Yitzchak." He didn't mention Avraham. Why? Because you need to honor your father more than your grandfather. In fact, Rashi brings down these words of Chazal on the spot: L'Elokei Aviv Yitzchak, Chayiv Adam b'chvoid Aviv Yoser mikvoid Zakenoi, Lefikach Tala b'Yitzchak v'loi b'Avraham. The reason why Yaakov hinges the honor on Yitzchak and not Avraham, you need to honor your father more than your grandfather. Even though obviously your grandfather's older, your grandfather's been around longer, you need to honor your father more than your grandfather. Okay. So tonight's Shiur, we're going to do something a little different. The Ramah writes in Yeridea that the meat and potato of learning is something called Shas and Poskim. There are two different things. There's Shas, Gemara, Talmud Bavli, and there's Poskim, Shas Utshuva Svarim. You need to know both. If somebody just learns Gemara, okay, they may have the Talmudic analysis, but they don't have the methodology of the Poskim, and vice versa. If you know how the poskim think, but you don't know the basis in Shas, also you're lacking in the foundation. So you need to know Shas, and you need to know poskim. So today we're going to analyze the methodology of poskim on a certain issue, and that is the issue of, do you need to honor your grandfather? B'chlal, do you need to honor your grandfather? You say, of course, you have to honor every Jew. You have to honor every human being. Yeah, of course you have to honor every human being, but let's say somebody comes to you, and he says, hey, you mind? I'm very hungry. You mind getting me dinner? Is there a mitzvah? You don't have to get him dinner. There's no chiyuv in the Torah to get somebody else dinner. You don't have to be mechabed somebody by feeding them. Let's say somebody says, I could use a good pair of slippers now. You mind getting me my slippers? Tell him, get lost. I should get you slippers. You're a nice guy. If you need tzedakah, I can give you tzedakah. I'm not getting you a pair of slippers. No thanks. There's no such mitzvah in the Torah to get somebody a pair of slippers or to feed them. That is reserved for a father. The Gemara in Kedushin says, Eizeho kibud, machalehu, you feed them, mashtehu, you give them to drink, malbishai, you clothe them. This type of kavod, feeding, giving to drink, dressing, is reserved for a father. The question is there a chiyuv kavod to a grandfather? That's what we want to discuss. Well, the Marik was Rav Yosef Cologne, who was one of the Gedolei Italia in the 15th century. He lived from 1420 to 1480. And he lived a very difficult life. In the 15th century, he was chased from one city to the next. In fact, he writes in one of his Sharashim, in Sharish Ayin Beis, that he was reduced to being, instead of a Rav of a city, he was reduced to teaching little children He was a Malamed Dardiki, but ultimately he was one of the great poskim of the time. And he raises the following question. If, let's say, a grandfather passes away, and there's no one to say Kaddish, can a grandson say Kaddish for the grandfather? Marik says, can he? Of course he can. The only thing is, it's not more than anybody else, any other Jew saying Kaddish for another Jew. Any Jew could say Kaddish for any Jew. Says Marik, there is no inyan whatsoever of a grandchild to say Kaddish for a grandfather. Says Marik, you know why? Because where does the chiyuv of Kaddish come from? It's a chiyuv of kavod. You have to show kavod to a parent by saying the Kaddish. Says the Marik, a very amazing thing. He says, on the fourth line, in Shal Teshuvas Marik, Shorish Mem Dalet, he says, V'kol shekain, De'lefi hanir la'anias daiti, ein leben haben loymar Kaddish b'shvil zekeno, yos miyadam acher. There is no inyan to say Kaddish for a grandfather more than anybody else. Why not? He says, Shaharei loy matzinu b'shom makoim sheyischayev ela b'chvoid ha'av v'ha'im. The only chiyuv you have is to honor your father. The only chiyuv you have is to honor your mother, to honor your father's wife when your father's alive, to honor your mother's husband when your mother's alive, and to honor your older brother. Those are the only chiyuvei kavod that we have. Now, I happen to be a very big proponent of honoring your older brother. So I make sure my younger siblings know about that. You know, there's a special drasha, Rabbi Sachicha Gadol, right? Kavod S. So anytime, my brother gets out of line, all I have to say is S. And I remind him of the mitzvah d'oraisa of honoring your older brother. But there is no Gemara in Shas, there is no pasuk in the Torah that you need to honor your grandfather. And therefore the Marik says there is no inyan to say Kaddish for a grandfather. He says an amazing Sharei loy matzinu b'sham makoim sheyischayev ela b'chloid ha'av. The only source we have, the only precedent we have is honor your father. Nowhere does it say honor your grandfather. So you say, what do you mean? But I feel it's a nice thing to do. My grandfather is an old man. He has white hair. I feel it's very nice. You could start your own religion and put in your set of laws that you need to honor your grandfather. But according to Dinei HaTorah, we don't make up halacha. There has to be precedent in Shas. There has to be precedent in a Gemara. There is no Gemara or pasuk that says you need to honor your grandfather. A famous Gemara in Yevamos, B'nei banim hareihem kebanim. Grandchildren are like children. So grandchildren are like children. Then my grandfather is like my father. So then I would have to honor my grandfather because he's my father. Says the Marik, it's not true. B'nei banim hareihem kebanim is only regarding the mitzvah of pruruvu, right? We know there's a mitzvah, the iraisa of pruruvu, a boy and a girl. Let's say a person has 5 girls. Okay, if they have a grandson, then they're makayim the mitzvah of pruruvu. B'nei banim hareihem kebanim. But that's only legabi the mitzvah of pruruvu. But regarding any other inyan, there is no such concept of b'nei banim hareihem kebanim. In fact, there's even an opinion in the Gemara in Masechta Baba Basra that you could testify about your grandfather. How can you testify about your grandfather? He's like your father. The answer is no, he's not. He's not. Very nice. He gives you good, nice things. He loves you. But there's no mitzvah in the Torah of kibud according to the Marik. Why? Shaharei loy matzinu b'shum makaim. We don't find in any place that there is such a source. Comes the Rama. The Rama in Yerodei and Simon Reish Mem. The Rama says, there's no source. You have to honor your grandfather. It's a pasuk in the Chumash. It's a pasuk in the Suy's Parsha. We just read it. The Rama says in Yerodei, look at number 6. Yesh Oimrim, De'ein Adam Chai B'chvoid Avi Aviv. The Rama quotes the Marik. There's an opinion you don't have to honor your grandfather. Says Rama, Ve'eino Nirli. It doesn't seem to be correct. Ela Dechayev B'chvoid Aviv, Yoiser B'chvoid Avi Aviv. Avada, you have to honor your grandfather. It's only that you have to honor your father more than your grandfather. But of course you have to honor your grandfather. Says Rama, you know what the source is? Says Rama, the source is, look, the Rama writes this in parentheses. The proof is the medrash we just read. That Rabbi Yochanan says, a person is chayiv to honor their father more than their grandfather. So what does that mean to you? You don't have to honor your grandfather. Fakert. If it says you have to honor your father more than your grandfather, that's mashma. Avada, you have to honor your grandfather, just not as much as your father, right? If somebody says you have to do A more than B, that implies you have to do B, just you have to do A more. So the Marik says that we have never found a source anywhere that you have to honor your grandfather. Really? How about Medrash Rabbah on this week's Parsha? How about Rashi? Rashi says, Chayiv Adam b'chavod aviv yoser mi b'kloid zekenoi. You have to honor your father more than your grandfather. That's mashma, you have to honor your grandfather. And therefore the Ramah paskins, you have to honor your grandfather. So right now, if I ask you, if your grandfather says, get me a cup of water, do you have to do it? Machlekes haposkim. Marik says no. Marik says you don't have to do it. No such chiyuv. The Ramah says you got to do it. What's the makar? Rashi in this week's parsha. The Taz, by the way, even asks on the Marik. He says, "V'tema al dea harishayna." It's a tema on the Marik. Denela mimenu perish Rashi. It seems like the Marik forgot about Rashi in this week's parsha. Comes Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Okay, if you want to learn how to think, you have to learn Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Otherwise, you just hazy-brained. You have clouds in your mind. You have cobwebs. If you want to learn how to think, you have to learn Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger like this: do you have to honor your grandfather? It depends. Rashi says that the reason why Yaakov Avinu daven le'lekei aviv Yitzchak is because you have to honor your father more than your grandfather. Therefore, he invoked Yitzchak and not Abraham. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, really, you need to honor your grandfather more than your father. Why? So listen to the svar. The Gemara says in Yevamos, on Daf Hey Amud Beis, if your father comes to you and he says, do me a favor, I want you to be Mechalo Shabbos. I need the light on. I need to read the newspaper. Turn on the light. So the father says, turn on the light on Shabbos. Do you listen to your father? No, why not? So the Gemara says that Ish Yimai Vaviv Tiravish Ani Hashem Kolchem Chayavim B'chvaydi. The svar is Ata V'Avicha Chayavim B'chvaydi. Your father has to listen to me, and you have to listen to me. Yeah, you have to listen to your father. But the father that you have to listen to has to listen to Hashem. So the svara is, why listen to somebody when you and him are both subject to the same authority? That's the svara of the Gemara. Another Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph says the same svara. Following case. Your father says, get me a cup of water. Your mother says, get me a cup of water. Who do you listen to? Says the Gemara, you have to listen to your father. Why? Because you and your mother have to be mechabed the father. It's a big chiddush, not everybody knows this chiddush, that the wife has to be mechabed. Now it goes both ways, but in terms of machilehu in halacha, the wife has to be mechabed the husband. So therefore, if the father says, get me a drink, and the mother says, get me a drink, you listen to your father. Why? Ata v'imecha chayavim b'chvoid avicha. Okay, so we find two precedents for this idea. Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvoid hamakom. Ata v'imecha chayavim b'chvoid avicha. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, your father says, get him a drink. Your grandfather says, get him a drink. So we should say the same svara. You and your father both have to listen to your grandfather. So says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, really the honor of your grandfather comes first. Because Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvoid zekenecha. You get the svara? So says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, if that's the case, why did Yaakov Avinu daven l'lekei Yitzchak and not l'lekei Abraham? The honor of a grandfather is more important. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, very pashut, that when do you have to listen to your grandfather more than your father? That's if your father is alive. So now your father has to listen to your grandfather. So now you have to listen to the grandfather because Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvoid zekenecha. But if the father's not alive, and then, so he's patur from mitzvahs, he doesn't have to listen to the grandfather, then the whole binyan unravels, then you listen to the father, then the father comes first. In other words, when do you say the grandfather takes precedence over the father? That's when the father's alive. So the father's alive, he has to listen to the grandfather. If he has to listen to the grandfather, then we use the svara, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvoid zekenecha. But if the father's not alive, so then he has no chiyuvim to his father. Memela, then you have to honor your father more than your grandfather. Says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, tremendous chiddush. That if the father is alive, the grandfather comes first. If the father's not alive, the father comes first. Here, just like the opposite of what you would have thought. If the father's alive, so now he's mechuyev to listen to his father. If he's mechuyev to listen to his father, grandfather comes first. Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvayid zekenecha. But if the father is not alive, and that's what Rashi is talking about. When Yaakov Avinu Davin, the lekei of Yitzchak was not alive. If Yitzchak's not alive, Yaakov was mechuyev to honor Yitzchak more than Abraham. Why? Because really, if Yitzchak and Abraham were alive, then Yitzchak would have to honor Abraham. Now Yaakov would have to honor Abraham because Yitzchak would be subject to Abraham. But says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, if Yitzchak is not alive, he has no chiyuvim to his father, then Kavod Avicha comes first. You hear Rabbi Akiva Eiger's svara? Akiva Eiger says that he argues on the Ramah. So basically right now we have three shittas. Do you have to honor your grandfather? Listen carefully. The Marik says, do you have to honor your grandfather? Marik says, who's your grandfather? Grandfather is nothing in halacha. Grandfather is not recognized in terms of chiyuvei kibud. That's the shita of the Marik, and that's the first shita in the Ramah in Yerodei 7 Reish Mem. The Ramah comes along and says, not true. Says Ramah, Avada, you need to honor your grandfather, but you have to honor your father more than your grandfather. What's the raya you have to honor your grandfather? Rashi in this week's Parsha, because Rashi says that Chayav Adam Mechavod Aviv Yoiser Mikavod Zekenai. So the Ramah Shita is the father always takes precedence. Comes Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and he's in between the Marik and the Ramah. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says like this: if the father is alive, the grandfather comes first, since the father has to listen to the grandfather. If the father's not alive, and the father doesn't have to honor the grandfather, then the father comes first. Who do we pass on? We pass like the Ramah. Normative halacha is like the Ramah. The Ramah says, bottom line, you always have to honor your grandfather, but a father always takes precedence. The psak of the Ramah is the father always takes precedence over the grandfather. If the father says, be mechabed me, and the grandfather says, be mechabed me, and somehow it's a conflict, the Ramah paskins, you listen to your father.
How is he mechabed his father?
What?
How is he mechabed his father?
By davening, by invoking, that you know which Rebbeinu Shalom this is? This is Elokei Yitzchak. In other words, it's really just in terms of ceremonial. You know, Elokei Aviv Yitzchak. So let's analyze the psak of the Ramah. The Ramah says, father is always first. But wait a second. What happened to the Svara Rabbi Akiva Eiger? What happened to the Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Lamed Aleph? What happened to the Gemara in Yevamos, Daf Hey Amud Beis? Again, doesn't the Gemara say, if your father says, get me a drink, and your mother says, get me a drink, who do you listen to? You listen to the father. Ata v'imecha chayavim b'chvayid avicha. Yeah? And the Gemara says, if you have a choice between your father and the Rebbeinu Shalom, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvaydi. So then what in the world is the Ramah saying that the father takes precedence over the grandfather? Why don't you say, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvayid zekenecha? That's the kasha on the Ramah. The svara of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who argues on the Ramah, is a kasha on the Ramah. How could the Ramah say that you always honor your father more than your grandfather? What about the svara? Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvayid zekenecha. Your father has to listen to your grandfather. You have to listen to your grandfather. So grandfather should come first. That's the kasha of Shailas Tshuvas Tshuva Me'ava. Anybody know who wrote Shailas Tshuvas Tshuva Me'ava? Very good. The Talmud Muvak of the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar Flakos. Elazar Flakos was the primary disciple of Noda B'Yehuda, and he asked this kasha on the psak of the Ramah. He says on page 2 on the 6th line, V'kasha l'das Ramah, Gabe kvoid aviv v'zekenoi, lama yakdim kvoid aviv. Why should the father go first? Neimanami hanach kvoid avicha, forgo the honor to your father. V'asei kvoid zekenecha, and honor your grandfather. She'ata v'avicha chayavim b'kvoid hazakim. You and pops, they're both chayiv to honor your grandfather. That's the kasha of the Shas Tshuvas Tshuva Me'ava. So we're going to try to address this question. Everybody understand the question on the Ramah? We have a very well documented Sfar in Shas, Gemara in Yevamos Hey Amud Beis, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvaydi. We have a Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Aleph, Ata v'imecha chayavim b'chvayd avicha. Why does that svara not apply to a grandfather? Ata v'avicha chayavim v'chloid zikenecha. Yeah, everyone with me? Good. So the first svara we want to say is from Rav Shlomo Kluger, the Shas Tshuvos Tuv Tam Vadas. Remember, I used to daven a number of years ago next to Rav Shlomo Warman, who's the Rosh Hashiva of Hebrew Academy, Nassau County. He's a Talmud of Rav Blazer Silver. So he told me that his great-grandmother sat on the lap of Rav Shlomo Kluger when she was a little girl. Okay. I saw someone whose great-grandmother saw Rav Shlomo Kluger. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger the following svara. And with this svara we can answer this kasha of the Shas Tshuvos Tshuva Me'ava. Why do you have to honor your grandfather? Well, it's Klara Chakira. Do you have to honor your grandfather because you have an independent, you have to honor your father, and you have to honor your grandfather, you have an independent chiyuv to honor your grandfather? Or do we say, no, honoring your grandfather is a way, it's a form of honoring your father. It gives your father kavod when you show respect to his father. It gives your mother, they appreciate it. They feel good when you show reverence to their parents. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, that's it. The reason for honoring a grandfather, it's a form of honoring your father. So it suggests in the Sefer, Chavatzelos HaSharoin, it's a modern-day Sefer, Lamdash things on Chumash. He says, if honoring a grandfather is just a way of honoring your father, then it's pashut why, that if you have a choice between your father and your grandfather, you honor your father, and we don't say, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chvay zekeinecha. Because you don't have an independent obligation to honor your grandfather. It's only a way of honoring your father. Really, the honor to the parent is the primary obligation. Honoring the grandfather is just a way of showing reverence to your parents. So nobody would ever then say, well, you have to listen to your grandfather, and your father has to listen to your grandfather, so grandpa should go first. No. The only reason to honor the grandfather, it's a way of honoring the father. However, the Vilna Gaon, the Bir HaGra, we know the Bir HaGra on Shulchan Aruch is one of the most concise commentaries on all of Shulchan Aruch. Vilna Gaon says a different reason why you have to honor your grandfather. The Vilna Gaon says, B'nei banim harehem kavanim. Grandchildren are like children. That means your grandfather is called your father. So the reason, says the Gaon, why you have to honor your grandfather is because he's also your father. Meaning there's an independent obligation. You have to honor your primary father, and you have to honor anyone who falls under the umbrella category of father, which is also your grandfather. So if that's the case, we're back to the question then why would you honor your father more than your grandfather? Why wouldn't we say, Ata v'avicha chayavim b'chavod zekenecha? So now with this we come to me, the main part of tonight's shiur. Understanding the mitzvah of kibbud avayim. The Minchas Chinuch has a famous chakira. We know that if a person wrongs another Jew, so even if you do tshuva, Yom Kippur is not mechaper until you're maratza your friend, right? You have to ask your friend for mechila, otherwise Yom Kippur doesn't do anything. On the other hand, if it's just between you and God, then you just do tshuva and you're good to go, right? Right? Bein adam la'makom, Yom Kippur is mechaper, bein adam mechaver, ein Yom Kippur mechaper ad she'yiratzas chaver. So the Minchas Chinuch wants to know, let's say a parent asks you, do me a favor, kid, get me a cup of water. And you say, no, not really interested. It's an avera, and you need kapara. Do you need to ask the parent for mechila? Is it an avera ben adam lachaveroi, or is it an avera ben adam lamakim? So let's say, Ezra, you ask me, Rabbi, get me a cup of water. And I say, no, I'm not really in the mood. You're a nice guy, but I'm not getting you a cup of water. I don't have to ask you for mechila. If I insult you, I have to ask you for mechila. I have no chiyuvim to bring you food. I don't have a chiyuv to anybody to bring them food. I don't have a chiyuv of kavod in terms of achila. So if I don't do it, I don't have to ask mechila. So maybe you'll say, the only reason you have to bring a drink to a parent is because God said so. God gave an additional halacha to a parent. Fine, that's between you and God. But it's not interpersonal. It's a chiyuv ben adam la'makom. Or do we say that once the Rebbeinu Shalom said you have an additional responsibilities to your parent, so now this becomes an interpersonal obligation, and if you don't fulfill it, now you have to ask the parent for mechila on Yom Kippur to get kapar. Is kibbud avayim ben adam la'makom, or is it ben adam lachaver? There are many sources that it's both. There's a chiyuv of ben adam l'makom and there's a chiyuv of ben adam l'chaver. For instance, the Ramban writes that if you look at the Aseret HaDibros, Ramban, the famous Ramban, he says the first 5 are ben adam l'makom, the second 5 are ben adam l'chaver. The next one will have the luch, right? We'll have okay. Yeah. So it's a question whether you're allowed to have. It could be ramach or not to have. Okay. Kabir Savicha v'Yasimecha is on the right side, right? Why is it on the right side? I understand. Believe in God. Don't serve idols. Don't swear in God's name in vain. But why Kabir Savicha v'Yasimecha? Why is that ben adam l'makom? The Ramban says because to create a human being, there are 3 partners: a father, a mother, and the Rebbeinu Shalom. By honoring your parent, it's showing honor to the other shutaf. It's showing honor to Hashem. So Ramban says, "Kabir Savich v'Yasimecha" is ben adam l'makom. Sefer HaChinuch writes that it's the most important mitzvah is not to be an ingrate, not to be a kafei toiva, not to ignore the tremendous toivas that somebody does for you. By recognizing and appreciating what a person's parents have done for them, that will engender in a person's heart the recognition that the Rebbeinu Shalom has created the person and has developed the person and gives the person everything that they have and has established the person. And therefore the Sefer HaChinuch says, by honoring your father, you come to recognition of Hashem. So we have these sources that honoring a parent is ben adam l'makom. Rabbi say, this to me is the most important maramakom we're going to discuss tonight. It's a very big chiddush. Chiddush of the Chayei Adam. Says the Chayei Adam, the chiyuvim to a parent is much more than ben adam l'makom. You know what it is? It's a chiyuv mamoin. It's pirayin chayv. If somebody lends you money, let's say somebody lends you $1 million, and you don't pay back, what are you called? Loive Rasha v'loi Mashalim. You're a Rasha. Someone lends you $100 and you don't pay them back. You're a Rasha. You're Pasal Eidos. And what if they lend you $1 and you don't pay them? You're also a Rasha. So think about it. Before you were born, your parents had to buy insurance, right? So how much was it 20 years ago, 30 years ago? I don't know, $1,000. Okay, yeah, but now let's put it 20 years later with all the inflation. The $1,000 25 years ago, 30 years ago is now $30,000. And they had to buy you food, formula, right, for 2 years. And they had you woke up your mother every single night for the first 9 months. How much would somebody charge not to take a hammer and bang you on the head after you waking them up 3 nights in a row? A lot of money, right? A nurse is $500 a week. So you owe them money. You owe your parent money. So if they tell you to get them a drink and you don't do it, you're a Rasha. Why? Because they're not asking you to pay back with money. They're asking you to pay back with kavod. You have a monetary shibud, bein adam l'chaveroi, to pay your parent back the kibud. Give him food, drink. Says the Chayei Adam. V'amru Chazal, number 21. They're called mitzvahs haben ala aveim hu piroin choiv. It's a payment. It's payback. It's a monetary chiyuv. Shahaben chayiv lefroya la'aviv ule'imoy hatoiva shegmalu. Umi sheina mechabdam. And somebody does not fulfill their chiyuvim. Nikra Rasha. You say, I've been called worse. No, this is pretty bad. Nikra Rasha. You're not good. Tichsiv loive Rasha v'lo yishalem. The Chayei Adam is not a sefer of Jewish, it's a sefer halacha. You have a monetary obligation to the parent to pay them back. You owe them cash. You owe them money. Included in the payment, sheyehoiv oisam ahava aza. You have to love them. Oh, why do you have to? I have to love my parent. You're mechuyev to love the parent as payback for the money that they gave you. Is that ben adam l'makom? That ain't ben adam l'makom. It's ben adam l'chaveroi. The same if someone lends you money, you have to pay them back. You owe your parents money. So is honoring a father and mother, is it ben adam l'makom or is it ben adam l'chaveroi? The Minchas Chinuch Chakira. The answer is it's both. It's ben adam l'makom. You have to show honor to Hashem's partner. By honoring your parent, that will bring you to honor Hashem. That's ben adam l'makom. But you have a monetary shibud to your parent. So it's suggested like this. If your father asks you to do something, and your mother asks you to do something, so you have to listen to your father, and your mother has to listen to the father, so you listen to the father, right? But if your father asks you to do something, and your grandfather asks you to do something, let's think very carefully. What chiyuvim do you have to the father? Well, ben adam la'makom, you have to show respect to God's partner, but you also have monetary obligations to the parent. The obligation to the grandparent, it's reasonable to say that you also, well, the grandparent is also one of your shutfim, also contributed to you being here. But who says that you have that monetary shibud to the grandparent? You say, what do you mean? Nowadays, you have bigger shibudim to the grandparent than the parent. But L'maisa, they're not the ones getting up at night. That's probably the main monetary obligation. But you could make the case that the shibud, the monetary shibud, that's to the parent. That's not to the grandparent. And therefore, when do you use the svara in Shas? That's when all obligations are equal. But when you're obligated to the father, and the obligation to the grandfather maybe is only a mitzvah ba'alma, then the obligation to the father would supersede the obligation to the grandfather. Here, I'll give you a mashal. The Achronim asks the following question. You say to your wife, tonight, I want steak, mashed potatoes, and I want it at 8:31. And then 2 minutes later she gets a phone call from your father. And your father calls up your wife and he says, I want steak, I want mashed potatoes, 8:31. Who does she listen to? Her husband or her father-in-law? She said, father-in-law. Since when does a daughter-in-law have to listen to a father-in-law? Well, this is the very sensitive subject of, do you have a chiv of kavod to your father-in-law and mother-in-law? Sorry to break the news. It's machlokes whether it's a chiv d'Rabbanan or a chiv d'Oraisa. The Smag says it's a chiv d'Oraisa. So, frek the Achronim, if a daughter-in-law has to listen to her father-in-law midairaisa like the Smag, what does she do if her husband tells her to do something for her, asks her to do something for him, and her father-in-law asks him? So the answer is she's responsible to the husband first. Why? Ata, ubalcha chayovim b'chvoid avicha. Why don't we say the husband has to listen to his father, she has to listen to his father. So if the husband says something and the father-in-law says, let her listen to the father-in-law. But nobody in the right mind would say that the father-in-law would take precedence over the husband. That would not be good. The answer is that her obligation to her father-in-law is just mitzvah ba'alma. But the obligation to her husband is a shibud mamayin. She signed something called a document. It's called right? She is meshubah to her husband. It's a monetary obligation. By the way, I'll tell you chiddush halacha, and whether you can be samech on this, you have to ask your local Orthodox rabbi. I'm not sure. I might be your rabbi, but I'm not sure if I'm local yet. So, what's the halacha? Davening is schlepping. Oh, your wife's hungry. She wants to eat Shabbos. So the easy answer is she can make kiddush. Yeah, she doesn't like to make kiddush. Some ladies, they don't like to make kiddush. They have this thing, they don't make kiddush. Says Moshe, she doesn't have to. She could just eat. She doesn't have to make kiddush. Why? Says Moshe, big kiddush. Because why do you have to make kiddush? You only have to make kiddush when the chiyuv suda begins. Since a woman technically is not allowed to eat until her husband comes home, so she has a shiva to the husband. So there's the mitzvah of suda has not been chal yet. She could eat without kiddush. Moshe passes halacha. A woman doesn't have to eat kiddush until her husband comes home. Why? She has a shiva to her husband. She's meshubed to wait for her husband to eat. So if she wants to eat something before, what could she do? She could eat. She doesn't have to make it. Okay, so what we're suggesting is the reason why the kavod to the father takes precedence on the kavod to the grandfather. The answer is the chiyuv to the father is twofold, is monetary and bein adam la makom, and the chiyuv to the grandfather is only mitzvah ba'alma, is only bein adam la makom. let's discuss one more issue. Take a look at the Gemara in Soita on Daf Memtes, Amid Aleph. Right? If anybody learns Daf Yomi, anybody wants to learn Daf Yomi, or anybody ever heard there's something called Daf Yomi, the Gemara says, they just learned it a few days ago, right? At the end of Masechta Soita. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Itbal Bey, number 25 on your sheet, Soita Memtes. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Itbal Bey, Barav Yaakov bar Barte. Rav Acha bar Yaakov put in great efforts to raise his grandson, Rav Yaakov. Rav Yaakov was the son of his daughter. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov had a daughter. This daughter had a son, Rav Yaakov. Rav Acha bar Yaakov raised his grandson. Ki Gadal, when he grew up, Amar Le, so Rav Acha bar Yaakov says to his grandson, Rav Yaakov, Ashken Imaya, do me a favor, get me some water. Amar Le. So his grandson said, I should get you water? Give me a break. Lav Brichana, I'm not your son. I should get you water. I don't have to get you water. Sorry. I know you would like it, and I hope somebody else gets it for you, but I'm not going to be doing it. Says the Gemara, V'hainu da'amri inchi. This is what people say. Rabbi bar tachana. The grandson always says, raise me, but at the end of the day, the son of your daughter doesn't honor you. It's an expression. You hear this Gemara? The Gemara says, Rav Acha bar Yaakov raised his grandson Rav Yaakov. One day he said, get me a glass of water, and his grandson said no. Yeah, right, Sipurei Tzadikim here. Right, he said, get me a drink, and he said no. That's the end of the Gemara. What does this Gemara say to you? Says the Gra, I'll tell you what it says to me. It's a raya to the Marik, that you don't have to honor your grandfather. Right, we started the Shiur with the Shita of the Marik, that nowhere in Kala Torah is there any precedent you have to honor your grandfather. Says the Goin, not only is there no precedent you have to, there's precedent you don't have to. Because Rav Acha bar Yaakov asked his grandson to get him a drink, and he said no.
He's in Russia.
He's not a Russia, he's a tzaddik. In fact, anybody whose name is mentioned in Shas could be Machayim Esim. Do you know any dead people? So Rav Acha bar Yaakov and Rav Yaakov, they both could bring them back to life. Says the Gra, it's not a riot to Marek. You know why? Because the Gemara says he was the son of his daughter. Says the Goin, so you have to honor your grandfather, but only your father's father and not your mother's father. That's the sheet of the Goin Halach L'maisa. The chiyuv kavod to a grandfather is only your father's father and not your mother's father. Why? Listen carefully. The Gra is l'shitase. The Gra holds, why do you have to honor your grandfather? B'nei banim hareim kabanim. Your grandfather's your father. Why is your grandfather your father? Because b'nei banim hareim kabanim. Well, the Gemara only in the Yerushalmi and Yavama says, b'nei banim hareim kabanim. B'nei banois loy hareim kabanim. Your son's son are your son. Your daughter's son is not your son. Halacha l'maisa. Therefore, the Goin says, you have to honor your father's father and not your mother's father. That's the psak of the Goin. Finished. Yeah, but I don't know, it doesn't sound right to me. It doesn't sound fair to me. That's the psak of the Gra. B'nei banim harein kavanim, v'loi b'nois banim. That means if your father's father asks you to do something and your mother's father asks you to do something, who do you listen to? Avada, your father's father. You don't even if your mother's father asks you to do something, you have no chiyuv kavod according to the Omega. Do we paskin this way? No. Shlomo Kluger writes. Shlomo Kluger says in Tov Tamadas number 30 that it's pashut. You have to honor your father's father and your mother's father. There's no difference. How do we explain that? Rav Shlomo Kluger's l'shitase. Why do you have to honor your grandfather? According to Rav Shlomo Kluger, it's a way of honoring your father. It shows your father respect when you honor his parents. So then what's the chiluk? If the whole reason you have to honor your grandfather is the way of honoring your father, then it would apply to your mother's parents as well. It's a way of, you have to honor your mother, it's a way of honoring your mother is by honoring your mother's parents. Now, according to Rav Shlomo Kluger, grandmother would be like a mother. Because the same way you honor your mother's father as a way of honoring your mother, you'd honor your mother's mother as well. Okay, that's the Rav Shlomo Kluger. Halach l'maisa. The Ramah, in the Shas Chuvas Ramah, in number 32, Shas Chuvas Ramah Kuf Yirches, The Rama also concurs with what we just said from Rav Shlomo Kluger, that you have to honor your mother's father, and there is no chiluk. So let's come back for a moment to the Gemara in Soita on Daf Mem Tes. The Gemara in Soita said that Rabbi Yaakov, when his grandfather asked him to get him a cup of water, he said no. The Vilna Gaon says either this is a raya to the Marik, that there's no chiyuv kavod to a grandfather, or it shows you don't have to honor your mother's father. But we who paskin, you have to honor your grandfather, and you have to honor your mother's father. How do we learn Shah in the Gemara in Soita? So, we'll end with this. The Shvus Yaakov says no, just the opposite. The Gemara in Soita is a raya, you have to honor your grandfather, and you even have to honor your mother's father. Why? Because what did the grandson say to Rabbi Yaakov? He said, the way Rashi learns it, if you look back at number 26, he said like this. He says, Bar baratachanam, your daughter's son. Ve'ein olai l'chabedcha keben. I don't have to honor you like a son. Mashma, I don't have to honor you like a son, but I do have to honor you like a grandson. So the Shvus Yaakov says just the opposite. The Gemara in Soita is mashma. You have to honor your grandfather, and you even have to honor your mother's father. So halacha, let's just, here's the executive summary. You ready? 2-minute synopsis. Halacha l'maisa. Do you have to honor a grandfather? We have a bunch of shitas. Shita of the Marik is, there's no chiyuv kavod to a grandfather. The Rama disagrees. The Rama says, there is a chiyuv kavod to a grandfather. What's the source? Rashi in this week's Parsha. Elokei aviv Yitzchak, v'lo elokei aviv Abraham, Malamid shechayv adam mechayd aviv, yosem mikvayd avi aviv. Shita of the Rama is how we paskin. You have to honor your grandfather. Rabbi Kiva had a chidush. Rabbi Kiva said, if the father's alive, the grandfather comes first. Since your father has to honor his grandfather. If the father's not alive, the father comes first. And regarding your mother's father, the Vilna Gaon says no. But the Raman, Rav Shlomo Kluger, and this is how we paskin, say there is a chiyuv kavod. And what's important to remember is the concept of kaves avicha v'yasemecha is twofold. It is, first of all, bein adam la'makayim, by recognizing those who brought you into this world, you will come to appreciate the primary cause of existence, and that is Rebbeinu Shalom. But ultimately, there is a shibud mamayim. There's a monetary obligation. There's a concept of piroin chayv that a person has to the parents who have invested so much. And says the Chai Adam, someone who is zahir b'kibud avayim will have arichas yamim v'shanim. Have a wonderful evening. Shkayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.